On January 23rd, 3i Atlas is believed to have left behind a strange object near Earth, as NASA has been continuously monitoring the 3i Atlas system for 4 months. A shocking hypothesis suggests that before leaving the solar system, 3i Atlas secretly released an ultra-dense object and guided it into Earth's graveyard orbit, where it could camouflage itself among space debris thanks to an absolute black outer shell and autonomous control capabilities. This object is described as a global surveillance system, capable of silently intercepting telecommunications data and even posing a risk of interfering with humanity's military infrastructure. According to that argument, it is a powerful governing tool designed for covert containment, turning Earth into a kind of monitored colony under constant observation by a hidden gatekeeper lurking in near-Earth space, thereby restraining human development and freedom. Alongside this hypothesis, 3i Atlas has also sparked controversy due to another abnormal sign. Its brightness changes by exactly 47% every 6 hours and 41 minutes, repeating like clockwork for months without any deviation, slowdown, or cycle drift. Research teams at NASA and various international organizations have stated that they have ruled out the possibility of the object releasing gas or being influenced solely by gravity in the usual way, making hypotheses of an artificial origin or extraterrestrial technology increasingly noteworthy. Across a narrow slice of telemetry that most analysts would treat as noise, 3i at last registered a secondary track that did not follow the outbound vector, and the anomaly was subtle enough to hide inside ordinary orbital clutter, while still remaining consistent enough to be repeatable. The working hypothesis proposes that Atlas released a compact hyperdense payload during the departure sequence, and that the release was timed to occur within seconds of the main acceleration event so that observers would anchor their attention to the brightest motion and miss the smallest one. If 3i at last was attempting concealment rather than destruction, then at last would not choose a clean orbit where the object could be isolated and identified, and at last would instead choose an environment where human infrastructure already produces confusion by default. The graveyard orbit above the geosynchronous belt offers exactly that camouflage, because the region is filled with retired satellites, spent stages, and silent fragments that still reflect radar in familiar patterns while contributing almost nothing to public awareness. The data suggests that the separated object executed a precision burn rather than a passive capture, and the burn implies guidance, intent, and a target longitude rather than a random insertion, which is why the hypothesis treats the event as an operation instead of an accident. When at last's remnant candidate is placed into the graveyard layer, the narrative changes from a visitor passing through to a system staying behind, because 3i at last can be gone while at last's influence remains present in Earth's orbital neighbourhood. The anomaly is not the existence of debris in that region, since debris is expected, but the possibility that Atlas selected the debris field as a shell, and that Atlas hid a working machine inside the shape of human trash. That is where the emotional pivot begins to form, because if 3i at last can depart while leaving a quiet watcher above the equator, then at last has turned our own orbital graveyard into a place that feels less like storage and more like a blindfold. And as the orbit settles into the background of everyday life, the question remains suspended in the same cold data that revealed it. Because at last did not vanish into darkness, Atlas simply relocated the mystery to a higher floor. The second hypothesis begins where ordinary debris should behave predictably, because in the graveyard orbit everything drifts, everything decays, and everything slowly forgets the longitude it once held. Yet the remnant candidate associated with 3 Atlas appears to resist that natural forgetting. If Atlas had released nothing more than a dead fragment, then the object would have followed the lazy mathematics of orbital perturbations, and the track would have smeared into the same westward crawl that defines the graveyard's slow motion. Instead, the telemetry model suggests station keeping, and station keeping implies expenditure, because at last would need to counter small forces that never stop pushing, including solar radiation pressure, gravitational gradients, and the accumulated nudges from nearby mass. The anomaly becomes sharper when collision probability is introduced, because a drifting satellite shell should not care what approaches it, and a dead hulk should not step aside like a living thing making room. One modelled encounter describes a retired Russian platform passing too close for comfort, and the expected outcome in a purely passive environment would be a cascade of fragments. Yet the remnant candidate attributed to 3 at last appears to shift position just enough to avoid contact. The hypothesized mechanism is micro-thrusting using cold gas or an equivalent low-signature propellant, because At Last would prefer a method that produces minimal heat and minimal plume brightness, and because At Last would benefit from movements that look like measurement error until they repeat. What matters is not the size of the adjustment, which can be small in meters and still decisive, but the pattern of behavior, because At Last seems to move away and then return, and the return suggests the object is defending a chosen slot rather than fleeing danger. This is where the autonomy question becomes unavoidable, because an object that corrects its own orbit is not merely surviving, and an object that corrects its own orbit is executing policy. If 3 At Last placed a device into the graveyard layer, then At Last did not choose the region because it was empty, and At Last chose it because it was crowded, and crowding provides both cover and opportunity. The emotional consequence is quiet and heavy, because the graveyard orbit stops feeling like a cemetery and starts feeling like a hallway, and somewhere in that hallway At Last may be standing still on purpose, waiting without blinking. Once the remnant candidate linked to 3i Atlas is treated as an active system rather than inert debris, the next hypothesis asks what Atlas gains by occupying the graveyard layer, because Atlas chose a position that overlooks the geosynchronous belt like a balcony above a city. The geosynchronous ring carries the quiet bloodstream of modern civilization, and Atlas would not need to touch the ground to influence the planet, because Atlas can listen to the traffic that rises and falls through relay satellites every second. A direct jamming operation would announce itself immediately, and Atlas would be seen as a loud intruder, yet a passive interception would be almost invisible, and Atlas would become a silent witness instead of a vandal. The man-in-the-middle model fits that preference, because Atlas could copy rather than corrupt, and Atlas could harvest rather than disrupt, while human systems continue functioning with the comforting illusion of normality. In practical terms, the hypothesis proposes inductive coupling or ultra-sensitive passive receivers, because antennas leak energy upward as spillover radiation, and Atlas could treat those leaks as whispers that can be reconstructed into meaning. Every encrypted packet would still be encrypted, yet Atlas would possess the full archive of exchanges, and Atlas would gain the power of time, because analysis can be slow while collection is constant. The anomaly is not that signals exist, since signals fill space like faint fog, but that Atlas may be positioned precisely where signal density is highest, where banking data, military comms, navigation timing, and private conversations share the same orbital highway. If 3 At Last intended to install a governor rather than conduct a raid, then At Last would want oversight, and oversight begins with observation, and observation begins with access to the channels humans rely on most. This is where the emotional temperature shifts from curiosity to unease, because Atlas does not need to invade cities to understand them, and Atlas does not need to land to map a civilization's habits. The bridge forward is simple and unsettling, because if Atlas is collecting without interference, then Atlas is not acting like a weapon in a hurry, and Atlas is acting like a system designed to remain, to learn, and to wait. If the passive interception hypothesis is even partially correct, then the story of 3 At Last stops being about a visitor passing through, and At Last becomes a presence that can remain while appearing absent, because At Last can hide inside the background noise of our own infrastructure. That realization creates a strange inversion of scale, because the largest object, the departing craft associated with 3i Atlas, is the easiest thing to notice, while the smallest object, the remnant candidate tied to Atlas, may be the one that matters most. In the graveyard orbit, the sky is crowded with forgotten machines, and Atlas could be wearing that crowd like camouflage, and Atlas could be protected by the fact that humans do not stare at their trash once it has been pushed out of the way. The anomaly deepens when silence is added to the equation, because if At Last were truly harmless debris, then no one would need to hide it, and if At Last were truly harmless debris, then no one would need to avoid naming it. A quiet object that station keeps, that dodges, and that returns to its chosen slot suggests a rule set, and rules imply purpose, and purpose implies that 3 At Last did not leave behind randomness, and At Last left behind intent. Yet intent does not automatically mean hostility, because a monitoring system can exist without firing a shot, and a governor can operate without announcing itself, and Atlas could be watching for thresholds rather than hunting for victims. The uncomfortable thought is that Atlas may not be listening for secrets, and Atlas may be listening for patterns, because patterns reveal readiness, and readiness reveals when a species is about to change phase. If Atlas is a guardian device, then Atlas might be waiting for signs of expansion. And if Atlas is a quarantine mechanism, then Atlas might be waiting for the moment humans attempt to leave the cradle in large numbers. That is the question hanging in the dark above the equator, because 3 Atlas is gone from our telescopes, yet Atlas may still be present in our orbit, and Atlas may be measuring us in a way we cannot feel. So before the next chapter begins, the mind is left with a single suspended possibility. Because if Atlas is not merely observing, then Atlas must be enforcing something. And the only mystery is what rule Atlas was built to enforce. The enforcement hypothesis becomes more plausible when mass is introduced, because a device that intends to persist must be difficult to remove, and Atlas would not choose fragility if Atlas was designed to outlast human attention. In the orbital environment above the geosynchronous belt, even small objects can reveal their presence through gravitational perturbations, and the remnant candidate associated with 3 Atlas appears to influence nearby trajectories in a way that suggests unusual density. A standard piece of debris, shaped from aluminum panels and hollow structures, would behave like a light shell, yet the inferred mass of the Atlas remnant candidate implies a compact body, as though Atlas compressed substance into a volume that does not match ordinary engineering. One working estimate compares the density to osmium, and another reaches toward neutron-like material as a speculative upper bound. And while the exact composition remains unknown, the important signal is the mismatch between size and weight. If Atlas carries extreme density, then Atlas carries inertia, and inertia becomes a form of security, because an object that is hard to push is also hard to relocate, and an object that is hard to relocate is hard to neutralize. The energy question follows naturally, because station-keeping, micro-thrusting, and continuous sensing require power, and Atlas cannot rely on large solar arrays if Atlas intends to remain visually anonymous. This is where the hypothesis shifts from sensor to battery, because Atlas may store energy internally, and Atlas may treat time as its main resource, spending small amounts of power for thousands of years rather than large bursts for short campaigns. A long-duration system does not need to act quickly, and Atlas would not need to act loudly, because Atlas can afford patience, and Atlas can afford silence while human generations turn over beneath it. The emotional weight of that patience is subtle, because a threat that lasts minutes is frightening, yet a presence that lasts millennia is something different, and Atlas becomes less like an attacker and more like a permanent feature of the sky. So the bridge forward is not toward battle but toward management, because if 3 Atlas left behind a dense, enduring object, then Atlas may have left behind a tool built not to win a fight, but to maintain a rule. When endurance is assumed, the next hypothesis asks how Atlas reports its endurance, because a governor that never communicates is merely a statue, and Atlas behaves less like a statue and more like a system with a schedule. Across repeated observation windows, analysts describe a periodic pulse, a quiet surge in activity that appears every 7.1 hours, and while the signal is not publicly confirmed in detail, the pattern itself functions as an anomaly, because randomness rarely repeats with such clean regularity. If Atlas is emitting on a tight cadence, then Atlas is not simply collecting data, and Atlas is also exporting something. An export implies an audience beyond Earth orbit. The phoning home hypothesis frames the pulse as a narrow beam transmission, because Atlas would avoid broadcasting in all directions if Atlas intended to remain hidden, and Atlas would prefer a thin, disciplined channel aimed outward like a whispered report. In that model, Atlas could be sending compressed status packets rather than raw archives, and Atlas could be summarizing human activity into categories, such as technological acceleration, conflict intensity, launch frequency, and anomaly detection response. A signal like that would not need to be long, because a caretaker does not narrate every detail, and Atlas would only need to update the parent network on whether the monitored territory remains stable. This is where the emotional profile shifts into something colder than fear, because a predator hunts, but a bureaucracy evaluates, and Atlas begins to resemble an instrument of oversight rather than a weapon of conquest. The rhythm itself becomes a kind of heartbeat, and the heartbeat becomes a motif, because Atlas is not alive, yet at last imitates the most human symbol of life, repeating and repeating in the same interval as though the sky has learned to breathe. If 3 at last moved on to another target, then at last may still be tethered to a larger architecture, and at last may be one node in a chain of watchers distributed across many worlds. The transition forward arrives as a quiet question, because if At Last is sending reports, then At Last must also be waiting for instructions, and the only uncertainty is what condition would cause At Last to change its status from observation to intervention. The governor hypothesis does not begin with war, because the most efficient form of control is often the one that never looks like control, and At Last could enforce limits without ever revealing itself as an enforcer. In the simplest framing, 3 At Last would not need to conquer Earth in the theatrical sense because conquest is expensive, conquest is noisy, and conquest creates resistance, while monitoring is cheap, monitoring is quiet, and monitoring can last longer than any occupation army. If At Last is positioned above the geosynchronous belt, then At Last occupies the high ground over the channels that define modern capability, and At Last can influence outcomes by shaping information rather than by firing weapons. The mechanism of restraint could be passive at first, because At Last can learn the baseline of human behavior, and At Last can watch for thresholds that indicate escalation, such as mass launches, coordinated militarization of orbit, or attempts to build deep space propulsion at scale. A governor does not need to punish every mistake, and At Last would only need to prevent irreversible steps, because the goal of a governor is not to destroy the subject, and the goal of a governor is to keep the subject within a permitted range. That is why the absence of overt aggression can be interpreted as strategy rather than mercy, because At Last may be designed to allow growth, and At Last may be designed to stop growth only when it becomes dangerous to the surrounding system. The restraint mechanism could exploit human fragility, because Earth's dependence on satellites is not a secret, and At Last can treat that dependence as leverage, and At Last can use the risk of orbital debris cascades as a shield against retaliation. If humans attempt to remove the remnant candidate, then the resulting fragmentation could threaten the very infrastructure humans need to coordinate a response, and At Last would not need to threaten directly, because physics itself becomes the warning. This creates a new emotional tension, because the story stops feeling like a sudden invasion, and the story starts feeling like a quiet ceiling placed above a civilization, low enough to be felt but high enough to be denied. 3 At Last may have departed, yet At Last's presence would mean the departure was only a change of posture. And the unsettling possibility is that humanity has not been attacked at all, because humanity has been assessed, categorized, and placed under supervision. Once supervision is imagined, the Gardner hypothesis arrives almost naturally, because a governor watches behavior, but a gardener watches growth, and At Last could be tasked with monitoring not only what humans do, but what humans become. The seed concept suggests that 3 At Last may have introduced a subtle, biological or informational payload long before the main anomaly was noticed, and At Last could now be measuring the development of that payload the way a scientist measures a culture in a dish. In this model, At Last is not searching for conversations or bank transfers for their own sake, and At Last is searching for signals of transformation, such as shifts in health patterns, mutation rates, cognitive trends, or technological choices that emerge without clear origin. A gardener does not harvest immediately, and At Last would not need to rush, because time is the one resource that a long-lived civilization possesses in abundance, and At Last can afford to wait through centuries the way humans wait through seasons. The microhook inside this hypothesis is psychological, because it reframes humanity from actor to crop, and it reframes progress from freedom to cultivation, and At Last becomes the silent hand that checks the soil without ever touching the plant. If the remnant candidate is both dense and enduring, then At Last can remain in orbit as a permanent sensor platform, and At Last can trigger a change only when the monitored variables cross a threshold that was defined elsewhere. That threshold could be violent, such as nuclear escalation, or it could be subtle, such as the first successful attempt to leave Earth in a coordinated fleet, because At Last would interpret a fleet not as exploration, but as expansion. This is where the heartbeat motif gains another meaning, because a pulse every 7.1 hours could be a report, and a report could be a timer, and a timer could be counting down toward a phase shift. The Gardner hypothesis does not prove malice, yet it does prove asymmetry, because the gardener decides when the field is ready, and the field does not vote on the harvest. So the transition into the next chapter carries a quiet dread, because 3 At Last is no longer the central mystery, and At Last becomes the central pressure, and the only question left hanging is whether At Last is merely watching our growth, or preparing to prune it. While the remnant hypothesis places At Last above Earth like a silent instrument, The brightness anomaly places at last far away, in interstellar motion, and still behaving as though it carries a metronome inside it, because 3 Atlas does not only leave behind questions, Atlas creates questions while it travels. For 122 days of continuous observation, the measured brightness of 3 Atlas has shifted by roughly 47% on a cycle of 6 hours and 41 minutes, and the unsettling detail is not the existence of variation, because asteroids and comets vary all the time, but the precision of the repetition, because at last repeats without drift. In natural systems, rotation periods wander, and thermal stresses accumulate, and small torques from sunlight slowly alter the spin state, yet at last holds the same interval as though a clock is regulating it, and the data shows no meaningful deviation even when conditions should introduce noise. If the brightness curve were caused by tumbling alone, then the shape of Atlas would need to be extreme, with an elongated ratio often modelled near 10:1, and while such shapes are not impossible, the stability of the timing remains the true contradiction, because an irregular object does not maintain a perfect beat in a messy universe. That contradiction becomes sharper when the measurement is reframed as a behavioural variable rather than a physical one, because brightness is not just light, and brightness is also the way an object presents itself to observers. An atlas presents itself in a rhythm that looks engineered. The hypothesis-driven interpretation does not claim intent as a fact, yet it treats intent as a live possibility, because at last behaves like a system that has been tuned, and tuning implies either an unknown natural mechanism or an internal regulator. The emotional effect is subtle and persistent, because the mind can accept a strange rock, and the mind can accept a strange orbit, but the mind struggles with a strange rhythm that refuses to degrade, and Atlas becomes less like a visitor and more like a signal wearing the shape of a visitor. Even if the mechanism were purely natural, the pattern would still demand explanation, because the precision forces scientists to search for a stabilizing process strong enough to overcome every perturbation, and Atlas has not yet offered any visible source for that stabilization. This is why the anomaly matters beyond curiosity, because 3 Atlas is moving away, and Atlas is growing dimmer, and the window for observation is closing. Yet the rhythm continues as though Atlas is indifferent to being watched, and the bridge forward is unavoidable, because if Atlas is not drifting in time, then either our models are missing a rule that nature has been using quietly all along, or Atlas is demonstrating that something inside it is keeping time on purpose. The first line of defense for any anomaly is rotation, because rotation can mimic intention without containing intention. An Atlas could simply be a strangely shaped body turning in sunlight, while observers mistake geometry for design. In that model, 3 Atlas would present alternating faces, one brighter and one darker, and the light curve would rise and fall as Atlas spins, which is exactly what astronomers see in countless asteroids, and it is exactly why the hypothesis begins with the simplest mechanism. Yet the drift problem returns immediately, because rotation in space is never perfectly isolated. An Atlas travels through a field of tiny influences that should accumulate, including tidal gradients near planetary bodies, thermal outgassing at levels too small to detect directly, and the steady push of radiation pressure acting like a continuous hand on a spinning wheel. When researchers simulate tumbling motion for elongated shapes, the result is usually a period that wanders, and even if the wandering is slight, it becomes measurable over months, because a month is long enough for small errors to reveal themselves, and Atlas has been observed for 4 months without the expected slippage. To preserve the 6-hour and 41-minute cycle with no measurable deviation, the rotation hypothesis must stack conditions, because Atlas would need a specific shape, and Atlas would need a specific distribution of mass, and Atlas would need a specific surface composition, and Atlas would need a specific history of formation that produced all those properties at once. The more conditions that are required, the less the explanation feels like a default, and the more the explanation begins to resemble a carefully arranged scenario, which is why the natural model begins to strain under its own complexity. A second attempt shifts the cause from rotation to episodic surface activity, because a periodic release of material could change brightness by altering the surrounding dust environment. Yet the absence of detectable signatures pushes that idea into uncertainty, and Atlas continues to refuse the usual comet-like behaviours that would make the story easier. Even the idea of a sharp hemispheric contrast, where one side is coated in dark material and the other in reflective material, returns to the same drift barrier, because any free body in space should wobble, and at last does not wobble in the way the models predict. This is where the hypothesis-driven narrative tightens, because the failure is not a lack of imagination, and the failure is the consistent inability of thousands of simulated variations to produce a clock-like stability without introducing assumptions that feel increasingly unnatural. So the transition is not toward a conclusion but toward a fork, because either at last is demonstrating a stabilizing physical process we have not yet discovered, or at last contains a stabilizing mechanism that behaves like regulation, and regulation is the signature of systems that do not merely spin, but keep time. When rotation alone cannot carry the burden of the data, the next hypothesis reaches for outgassing, because outgassing can create thrust, outgassing can create torque, and outgassing can change brightness by surrounding a body with a faint reflective veil. In the history of interstellar visitors, outgassing has been used as a rescue explanation before, and at last would not be the first object to provoke that instinct, because when a trajectory or a light curve looks wrong, a hidden jet is often the simplest invisible cause. Yet the observational constraint arrives from spectroscopy, because the European Space Agency and other facilities have instruments designed to detect the chemical signatures of common volatiles, and the absence of water vapour, carbon dioxide, methane, and other expected markers removes the most familiar fuel from the equation. If 3 at last were venting material strongly enough to sustain a 47% brightness modulation on a strict 6-hour and 41-minute cadence, then at last would likely leave traces in the wavelengths those instruments monitor, and the silence in those bands becomes its own kind of evidence. That silence creates a thermodynamic corner, because periodic activity implies a periodic energy cycle, and a periodic energy cycle usually implies a reservoir and a trigger. Yet at last shows no clear sign of the volatile reservoir that would power such behaviour in a natural comet-like body. The hypothesis-driven view does not declare that outgassing is impossible, because outgassing could be exotic, and outgassing could involve molecules we are not looking for, yet the burden of proof rises as each familiar pathway is closed, and at last becomes harder to place inside known categories. If at last is not shedding detectable gas, then at last must be changing brightness through surface properties, orientation, or some form of controlled emission, and each option carries different implications for energy balance, because the sunlight absorbed and re-radiated must still obey conservation. This is why the problem feels like a dead end rather than a missing detail, because the data forces a choice between two uncomfortable possibilities, and at last either behaves naturally through a mechanism we have not modelled, or at last behaves unnaturally through a mechanism we have not yet admitted. The emotional bridge is quiet and heavy, because 3 at last does not need to announce its strangeness, and at last only needs to continue repeating its rhythm, while the best explanations fall away one by one, and the transition forward rests on heat, because if at last will not reveal itself through gas, then at last may reveal itself through temperature, and temperature is the one signature that even silence cannot fully hide. At this point the narrative reaches a fork that cannot be avoided, because 3 at last has given observers a rhythm that behaves like a machine while still wearing the appearance of a natural visitor, and at last forces the mind to choose how to interpret precision. If the universe contains a stabilizing process we have not yet named, then at last is a teacher, and at last is exposing a gap in our models the way a strange eclipse exposes an unseen moon noticed only by its shadow. But if the universe does not contain that process, and if the known perturbations should produce drift, then at last becomes something else, because a system that resists drift is not merely surviving, and a system that resists drift is correcting itself. Correction implies feedback, and feedback implies sensing, and sensing implies a design that was built to maintain a target state, which is why the word control begins to feel less like speculation, and more like a mathematical necessity. The emotional weight of that possibility is not panic but disorientation, because 3 at last does not have to threaten Earth directly, and at last only has to demonstrate that it can keep time better than nature usually does. So the microhook is simple and suspended, because if at last is controlled, then at last can be controlled by someone, and if at last is controlled by someone, then at last is not alone in the dark. And if at last is not alone, then the remnant above Earth stops being an isolated mystery, and at last becomes a node in a larger system that has been watching for a very long time. When gas signatures remain absent and rotation models remain strained, heat becomes the next anchor, because temperature is the shadow that sunlight leaves on every surface, and at last cannot travel through the inner solar system without negotiating that exchange. Infrared observations treat objects like honest storytellers because a body absorbs energy from the sun and then re-radiates it as thermal emission, and the balance between absorption and re-radiation reveals the nature of the skin that faces space. For 3i Atlas, the reported thermal measurements suggest something slightly but persistently unusual, because Atlas appears cooler than expected by roughly 15% when compared to bodies of similar distance and estimated size, and that difference is large enough to demand interpretation, while still small enough to hide inside ordinary uncertainty if one is not paying attention. A cooler than expected surface can arise in two broad ways, and Atlas sits between them like a coin balanced on its edge, because either Atlas reflects more sunlight than a typical dark asteroid would, or Atlas radiates heat away more efficiently than rough rock usually can. High reflectivity would mean Atlas is returning sunlight rather than drinking it, and a reflective surface often implies smoothness, and smoothness is rare in natural objects that have spent millions of years being sandblasted by micrometeoroids and radiation. Efficient thermal radiation could point to material properties that differ from the usual mix of silicates and carbonaceous dust, and while nature can produce exotic compositions, the combination of unusual reflectivity, unusual spectral features, and clock-like brightness modulation forces each new clue to carry more weight than it would in isolation. If Atlas is reflective, then Atlas might be coated in ice, yet ice should often betray itself through spectral signatures and sublimation behavior, and the lack of obvious outgassing complicates that picture, because a bright icy body near the sun tends to speak in vapor. If Atlas is metallic, then Atlas could remain smooth and reflective, and Atlas could also manage heat in ways that keep its surface temperature lower than expected. Yet metallic bodies in space are usually associated with fragmentation histories that leave jagged faces rather than polished planes. The hypothesis-driven narrative therefore treats the thermal anomaly as a pressure point rather than a verdict, because Atlas could still be natural, and Atlas could still be rare, but Atlas is becoming increasingly difficult to describe without inventing a very specific story of formation. The emotional shift is quiet and strangely intimate, because heat is not an abstract number, and heat is a sensation the human body understands, and the idea that 3i Atlas is colder than it should be makes Atlas feel less like a rock warmed by the same star that warms Earth, and more like an object that is resisting the sun's touch. That resistance becomes a bridge, because if Atlas can manage energy in an unexpected way, then Atlas might also manage light in an unexpected way, and the brightness rhythm may be linked not to tumbling chaos, but to engineered surfaces that behave with deliberate consistency. When reflectivity and temperature suggest an unusual surface, polarization becomes the next lens, because polarization is the geometry of light after it touches matter, and Atlas can reveal its texture through the way it organizes reflected waves. Natural surfaces tend to scatter light with a kind of statistical indifference, and even when a rock is bright or dark, the polarization signal often carries the rough randomness of a battered exterior. Yet the discussion around 3i Atlas includes the possibility of organized polarization that would be more consistent with smoother, more coherent surfaces. If Atlas reflects light in a way that aligns waves rather than scrambling them, then Atlas may possess facets, coatings, or structural regularity, and while that does not prove design, it narrows the range of natural histories that can produce such order after long exposure to interstellar radiation. The hypothesis grows more complex when spectroscopy is added, because spectral analysis from large observatories has indicated absorption features consistent with complex carbon-based compounds, and Atlas appears to sit between familiar asteroid signatures and familiar comet signatures without matching either cleanly. Organic compounds are not rare in space, and carbon chemistry is common in comets and interstellar clouds. Yet the specific pattern matters, because Atlas seems to carry a mix that feels slightly displaced from the categories astronomers use to keep the solar system organized. This displacement is not dramatic enough to be a headline by itself, but when placed beside the stable brightness rhythm and the cooler thermal profile, it becomes part of a cluster, and Atlas begins to look less like a single oddity and more like a coordinated set of oddities that reinforce each other. The origin story of 3i Atlas adds another layer of quiet scale, because Atlas arrived on a hyperbolic trajectory that confirms an interstellar path, and interstellar paths are long, and long travel times force every hypothesis to confront durability. Even if Atlas is only a few hundred meters across, the likely travel time is measured in hundreds of thousands to millions of years, and the mind naturally struggles with that span, because human technology has barely existed for centuries, and At-Last may have been moving through darkness since before modern humans learned to write. If At-Last is natural, then At-Last is a relic of ancient stellar neighbourhoods, carrying chemistry shaped by environments we have never sampled directly, and the anomalies could be lessons about diversity rather than evidence of intent. But if At-Last is artificial, then the durability becomes something else entirely, because an engineered object surviving for 1,000,000 years implies a design philosophy that treats time as an ordinary constraint, and it implies materials, shielding, and autonomy that exceed the human reference frame. The emotional consequence is not terror but humility, because 3 At-Last does not need to threaten Earth to rearrange human self-image, and At-Last only needs to exist as a plausible artifact to make our century feel small, and the transition forward returns to the remnant in Earth orbit, because if At-Last can endure for 1,000,000 years between stars, then At-Last can endure for 10,000 years above our equator, and the quiet watcher becomes not a temporary mystery, but a long-term condition of the sky. Occam's razor is often misunderstood as a preference for simple stories, yet the deeper meaning is a preference for fewer assumptions, and At-Last forces that distinction into the open because the simple, natural explanation has begun to demand a long list of special conditions. To keep 3 At-Last inside the category of an ordinary rock, the narrative must assume an extreme shape, and the narrative must assume a stable rotation state immune to drift, and the narrative must assume surface contrast sharp enough to produce a 47% brightness swing, and the narrative must assume an absence of detectable outgassing even when periodic behavior is present. Each assumption is individually possible, and nature is capable of producing rare outcomes, yet the combined stack begins to feel less like a default and more like a carefully arranged coincidence, and at last becomes a rock that must be exceptional in multiple independent ways at the same time. When an explanation requires many independent exceptions, it stops being parsimonious, because parsimony is not about being emotionally comfortable, and parsimony is about not multiplying unknowns beyond necessity. This is the point where the artificial hypothesis, once considered extravagant, begins to look structurally efficient, because a regulated brightness rhythm can be explained by controlled rotation or controlled emission, and controlled systems naturally maintain stable periods, and controlled systems naturally resist drift through feedback. A reflective surface that produces organized polarization can be explained by engineered coatings or facetted geometry, and engineered surfaces can remain coherent longer than fractured rock if they are built to survive, and At-Last would not need to be miraculous, At-Last would only need to be intentional. Even the absence of outgassing becomes easier to hold, because an artificial object does not require volatile jets to keep time, and At-Last could operate without leaving the chemical fingerprints that comets cannot avoid. None of this proves that 3 At-Last is artificial, and the hypothesis-driven method refuses to declare certainty where evidence is incomplete. Yet Occam's framing changes the emotional posture, because the question becomes less about whether the artificial idea is dramatic and more about whether the natural idea is now overfitted. Overfitting is what happens when a model bends itself to match every data point by adding complexity, and the danger is not that the model is wrong, but that the model is no longer predictive, and At-Last deserves an explanation that can predict what comes next, rather than merely excuse what has already happened. The bridge forward is therefore a quiet recalibration, because if the artificial hypothesis is treated as one option among others rather than a taboo, then the remnant above Earth becomes part of a consistent architecture, and At-Last becomes a system that observes, reports, and persists. And if At-Last is a system, then the final question is not whether we are alone, because 3 At-Last already implies that we are not isolated, and the final question is whether the watcher in our orbit is merely collecting data or deciding what humanity is allowed to become.